all this. Good afternoon. Please take your seats. I am really pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Richard Stallman. I first heard of Dr. Stallman way back in 1987 when I started working on a VAX computer, and we installed the great text editor Emacs, and was very grateful when we moved to Unix, and I sort of passed Survival VI that our sysadmin could get Emacs on our Unix box as well. And all these years later, can run it on my phone if I'd like. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard Stallman, the founder of the free software movement, the starter of the GNU projects, and the president and founder of the Free Software Foundation. Please give me a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
If there is any way to increase the light on the audience, that would be helpful. I didn't get enough sleep last night, and the more light over there, the more it will help keep me awake. Now, please don't take this personally, but I didn't come here to sleep with you. I want to stay awake. So, first, some requests for you. Number one, please don't put any photos in which I appear into Facebook, WhatsApp, or Instagram. Those three tentacles of the same surveillance company are a system to track people, and Facebook can recognize people in photos from their faces or the backs of their heads. So if you put a photo into any tentacle of that company in which a person appears, you're helping the company track that person, which is mistreating that person. It's a bad way to treat your friends, and it's a bad way to treat me. So please don't do that to me. Second, if you want to take a photo of me with a mobile device, please verify in advance that the functionality of putting geolocation into photos is disabled. Just turning off locations is not enough. It's likely to put in the last location it knew, which would be right here. That doesn't help. You've got to go to the camera app's parameters and turn off geolocation in photos. Of course, that depends on the mobile device. They're all different. Also, if you want to make a recording and distribute copies, either audio or video, that's okay if, first of all, you distribute the copies in the formats that are favorable to free software, which are the OGG formats and the WebM format. Second, make sure the distribution site permits anyone to download copies without having to run any non-free software on per own machine. And that includes JavaScript software sent by the site itself. It's a very bad thing when websites require visitors to run software from the site in order to make it work, and especially bad if that software is non-free software, which many of us will simply refuse to run, and we will use that site. And finally, please put on the recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license. This is a presentation of a point of view, not a piece of software or a manual that, or an educational work that ought to be free. So, what is free software? Free software is software that respects the user's freedom and community. It's a matter of freedom, not price. In some other languages, it's clearer. In Spanish, we say libre. It's not gratis. It's not about price at all. Price is a minor side issue. I'm really not concerned with whether you paid someone money to get a copy of a program or someone paid you some money to get a copy of a program. Fine. I don't think that's an important moral issue. I'm concerned with what the program does to you once you have a copy. Does it respect your freedom, or does it take your freedom away? That's the important moral issue that I've been fighting about for 30 years and more. So, what is a program? What is a computer? A computer is a universal computing engine, but really, conceptually, it's very simple. All it knows how to do is get the next instruction and do what that says, and get the next instruction and do what that says, and get the next one and do what that says. Millions of times a second, it will get the next instruction and do what that says. Well, the instructions come from a program, and depending on what instructions that program has, it will make the computer do this or that or anything else. The same computer will do anything at all if it's given the right instructions within the limits of what is possible. There are some things that computers just can't do, at least not today. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you, when really it's someone else. You might think your computer obeys you, when really it's obeying its true master all the time, and it deigns to do what you wish when the real master permits. But not much if you're in China, because Apple has outsourced the storage of personal data to the Chinese Communist Party, literally. So with any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's always one or the other, because there's no other possibility. When the users control the program, that's free software. Why so? Well, what is freedom? Freedom is having control of your own life, control of your own activities. Well, if you use the program to carry out an activity, control of the activity requires control of the program. So the programs that respect users' freedom and community, I'll explain in a minute or so why community comes into this here. The programs that respect users' freedom and community are the ones that users control. And for the users to have control of the program, they need to have the four essential freedoms. They are the practical criterion for a free program. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program any way you wish for any purpose of yours. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so that it does your computing activities the way you wish. Why is source code essential? Because, well, you can understand a program as source code, and you can't understand it as executable code. If you've learned the programming language, you can read the source code, see what it does, and change it to do what you want. But the executable code is hard even for a programmer to understand. If it's this small, fine. But if it's much bigger, that job, which is one form of reverse engineering, is tremendously hard. To tell the users, you're free to change this program, you just have to reverse engineer it first, that's mocking the users. That's not really respecting their freedom to change it. So part of freedom 1 is that the users can get the source code. Those two freedoms together give us in separate control of the program, meaning each user is free to change the program or not. So here we see one user exercising freedom 1 and changing the program, and 3 other users that are using it the way they got it and not touching anything. Separate control is essential, but it's not enough, because most users are not programmers. They haven't learned to understand and change source code, which is fine, because there are lots of other things to do in life. There's no reason why everybody should be a programmer any more than everybody should be a chef or everybody should know how to build buildings. But they, too, deserve control over their computing. How can they have it? Not through separate control. They need collective control. Collective control means the freedom to work with others to collectively exercise control over what the program does. And users do that by working together as a group. So at the top, we see a group of 3 users that are exercising collective control. They're working together to modify their version. 2 of them, the ones on the right, are directly changing the code. They must be programmers. The one on the left is not touching the code. Perhaps person is not a programmer, but does participate in control of the program through discussions about what changes they're going to make. This is how non-programmers can participate in the control. Now, those who collaborate this way are those who choose to. There can be other users who'd rather not. For instance, at the bottom, there are 2 other users of the same program that are using the original version. They're not participating in the group. And it could be for any reason. Maybe they don't know each other. Maybe they disagree about what changes they want. Maybe they don't trust each other. Or maybe tomorrow they'll meet each other and start working together, all 5, however they wish. Collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies and distribute them to others, give them or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. So that enables the group to function. So when one makes a modified version, person with per freedom 3 can distribute copies of that to others, and they, with freedom 2, can distribute more copies to others. They can do this within the group so that everybody in the group gets copies. They can also offer copies to those not in the group, which can include offering copies to the public, publishing the new version. So, I should repeat these 4 essential freedoms because they're the most important point here. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program any way you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it so the program does your computing activities the way you wish. Freedom 2 is to redistribute exact copies, giving them or selling them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. You're not required to do any of these things. The point is you're free to do them if you choose. Freedom 0 says you can run the program as you wish, but if you're a masochist, you're free to run it as you don't wish. You're also free not to run it. With freedom 1, if you have a portable tracking and surveillance device, please turn it off. And not only so that it won't make noise. So with freedom 1, you're free to change the program, but it's not mandatory. You can run it just the way you got it. You don't have to look at any of the source code. Most of us don't have the time or interest to look at the source code of most of the programs we use. With freedom 2, well, when you wish, you can make a copy and give or sell it to someone else, but it's never required. It's always up to you. And with freedom 3, if you've made a modified version, you are free to make copies to distribute to others, but it's not required. You can use your version privately. You never have to offer copies to anyone else. So, if the program carries these 4 freedoms, then it's free software. It respects the user's freedom and community, and thus this is ethical. This is the ethical way to make software available for people to use because it respects their freedom. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the users do not control the program, so it takes away their freedom. This program controls the users because it's non-free, because basically if the users don't fully have control over it, that means in at least part of the ways it functions, it has control over them. And the program's developer or proprietor controls the program, which means that that non-free program, simply because it's non-free, generates a system of unjust power for the owner over the users. This is the basic injustice of any non-free program. This is why I don't use them. I don't want to be subject to such injustice. But nowadays, the owners know about their power. They're fully aware of it. In fact, often they develop the program hoping it will give them power over some users. So they're constantly looking for ways they can pervert the functioning of the program to give them additional power over those same users, which means they put in malicious functionalities. So, you've heard the concept of malware. Malware means software designed to mistreat the users as it runs. That's a question of what's in the code. According to what's written in the code, it's either malware or not. Proprietary or free software is not a question of what's in the code. It's a question of how the code is made available. If it's made available respecting users' freedom, that's free software. If it's made available denying users' freedom, that's non-free software. The same code could be released as free software or could be released as non-free software, and sometimes it's released in both ways in parallel at the same time. So one of these is about what's in the code, and the other is about how it's made available. Philosophically, these are independent issues. In practice, proprietary software and malware go together. Proprietary software is typically malware. And the reason is that the developers constantly face the temptation to exploit their power and harm their users. Power corrupts, and proprietary software illustrates that perfectly. So what are these malicious functionalities? Often they spy on users. For instance, this example is the Amazon swindle, an extremely malicious device. I could illustrate almost every form of malware with that. It reports everything. It even reports what book is being read, regardless of where the user got it, and it reports which page number too. And if the user enters any notes, sent to Amazon. Highlight anything, sent to Amazon. Orwellian surveillance of reading. But spying is done by lots of proprietary programs. The main 4 proprietary operating systems all snoop on the users. I mean, Windows, Mac OS, Android, and iOS. Flash player spies. And of course, lots of apps spy. The majority, it seems, according to experimental surveys. Even flashlight apps spy on the user. Why does a flashlight app need to communicate over the net? It's only supposed to light up the screen. What is it doing? Asking, is it light or dark over here? Transportation apps like Goober spy on the user. In fact, the Goober app, I call it Goober because they pay drivers peanuts, but that's another issue. Goober makes users identify themselves, which is an unforgivable sin. And that's the basis for spying, because then whatever data they can collect, they know who it's about. And the Goober app tracks the user before and after the ride, too. And then lots of screaming apps things like Spotify and Netflix, they're tethered to a particular server. Any local program that depends on using a particular server is dangerous. The Fitbit is a very good example of that. It collects personal data and sends it to the company server, and then the company invites the user to buy back her own data. What gall. But Netflix and Spotify are the same. The users have to identify themselves to pay, so the company knows who the person is and records what that person listens to or watches. That's massive surveillance. So I say, out, out, damn Spotify. Another form of malicious functionality is DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, also known as digital handcuffs. That's when the software is designed to specifically to make it impossible to do what users want to do, which is share copies. Now, sharing is good, and with digital technology, sharing is easy, unless some tyrant perverts your technology to stop you. Well, they can only do that with proprietary software, you see. If the users had control of the program, the users would take apart the handcuffs so it didn't handcuff them anymore. Proprietary software is the vital enabler of any sort of malicious software. So this illustrates the infamous blue ray that attacks users when they try to do an unauthorized kind of use of the material on the disk. I have never used a Blu-ray disc in my life because I can't do it with free software, and I won't do it with non-free software. There are also backdoors. A backdoor is something in a program that listens for a command telling it to do something nasty to the user. If it weren't something nasty, the company wouldn't have to do it like this. It could just say, hey, here's a reminder. It might be useful for you to do such and such. Click here if you want to do it. But when it's something nasty, they don't give the user the choice. So this particular backdoor is in the Amazon swindle. It's a backdoor for remote erasure of books. It's hard to find backdoors by analyzing executable programs. So generally, we find out about them when we see them in operation. That's what happened here. In 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book one day in a grand Orwellian act. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. If I were writing fiction, I wouldn't dare make this up. This was so ironic, it sparked some criticism. So Amazon said it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. Right. Now, some people thought, okay, Amazon has made us a promise it won't oppress us so much. But it wasn't a promise. It was just a noise. It had no legal force. It wasn't a commitment, really. It was just something Amazon could say to pull the momentum out of the criticisms. Not everybody's, of course. And a few years later, it went back to remotely erasing books without even an order from the state. We also know that Android, well, iOS, first of all, has a backdoor for remote erasure of apps. Android's backdoor is more powerful. It can remotely erase an app, and it can forcibly remotely install an app. In fact, Google could make an app specifically for you and forcibly erase it using this backdoor. Then there's censorship. Apple was the pioneer in censorship of apps. The iPhone was the first general-purpose computer that users could not freely install software of their choice into. They were limited to installing things that Apple had approved from the App Store. And Apple practices that censorship arbitrarily according to its commercial and political postures. When users found ways to defeat the censorship, they called it jailbreak, recognizing that these devices are jails. So that's our term for a device that censors installation of apps. It's a jail. And then there is basically an upgrade that you can't refuse, or perhaps we should call it a downgrade. That's what happened with the PlayStation 3 when Sony told people, we've changed the protocol for playing games on the net. If you don't install this modified firmware, you'll no longer be able to play games. But if you do install the downgraded firmware, you will lose the ability to run gnu+linux on the machine. So give up this half of the functionality or give up this half. That's why we launched our boycott of Sony. There are also universal backdoors. A universal backdoor allows for forcible modification of the software at a distance. Windows has had a universal backdoor since Windows XP, which is when it was discovered by analysis of behavior of the system. Meaning, if you have made the mistake of having Windows running in your computer, Microsoft has already owned your computer. You are totally at Microsoft's mercy, and it can do any nasty thing to you at any time. Microsoft refused to acknowledge that Windows XP contained a universal backdoor, but then, I think it was in Windows Vista, it proudly announced the presence of the universal backdoor under another name. It's called Auto Upgrade. Same thing. Other universal backdoors exist in the Amazon swindle, of course, and in nearly all portable phones. In those, it is used to convert them remotely into full-time listening devices that listen to all the conversations around them and transmit all the conversations they hear. Doesn't matter whether you're making a call to anyone, because the modified firmware can listen all the time. And you don't have to talk into the microphone, you know, it can hear all the conversations in the room. And if you think you can get your privacy back by turning it off, surprise, there's no off switch. All there is a button that requests, "Oh, sir, telephone, would you be so kind as to switch off?" But once it's been modified, it says, "Certainly, I'm switching off," but it doesn't. It's lying. It keeps on running, listening, and transmitting, even though it pretends to be off. The only way to prevent it is to remove all the batteries. And that means all the batteries, because there could be more than one. And some models have batteries that can't be removed at all. Oh, there's one other way the developers can shaft users. Microsoft, when it discovers a security flaw in Windows, shows it to the NSA before fixing it, thus directly betraying all of its clients. I got this from Bloomberg News. In fact, we have hundreds of examples of malicious functionalities in proprietary software. They're listed in gnu.org/malware, categorized by type of malware, type of product or company. I've only mentioned a few, but they're enough to demonstrate that nearly everyone that uses proprietary software is using proprietary malware, is already a victim. They're already being dragged along behind the van of proprietary malware. And why do the companies do this? They can make more money by mistreating their clients, and they have no scruples. 30 years ago, proprietary software was an injustice for the basic reason that it is now. But malware was unusual. It was shocking and scandalous when you found that a proprietary software product was deliberately designed to hurt its users. Now it's so common that it's no longer a scandal. They got people used to it by making people feel they had no choice. Well, you have to be stubborn to have an easy choice. But if you work hard, you can make another choice. That's what the free software movement has done. And you're helping to do that. But I should point out that you can never trust a proprietary program. I've told you maybe 10 examples. We have 300 or more of proprietary malware, but there are thousands more proprietary programs about which we just don't know and can't know. Each one might be malware or might not. I'm sure there are at least a few that are not malware, but we can't identify any of them. Every one of them is either certain malware or possible malware. You can never have a rational basis to trust them. So it's only blind faith. It's blind faith or don't use it. So it's basically asking to be taken. On the other hand, with free software, with free software, the users are not helpless. The users control the program. The users are free to study the source code separately or together. And those few in the community who do this, because it's a small fraction, they're protecting everybody. Because if any of them sees anything malicious, of course, person will announce this, will raise a scandal, it will be fixed, and the community will have protected everyone. And even if you never know about this problem, you'll get the fixed version sooner or later. You are protected by the community. Now, this is not a guaranteed defense. We'd have to work systematically and organize funding, which is starting to happen, to make it a solid, powerful defense. But at least it's a defense. It's a lot better than being totally defenseless at the mercy of the software owner, which is what happens to all users of proprietary software. So this is the only known defense against malicious functionalities and the only basis for rational trust in a program. So what you need to do is escape from proprietary software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. We built it with the GNU operating system and the Linux kernel. I started developing GNU in January 1984, having announced the project in September. I wanted to make it possible to use a computer in freedom. That was impossible in 1983 with the modern computers of the day. Every computer requires an operating system to be of any use, and all the operating systems for those computers were proprietary, so as soon as you tried to make it do anything by installing the proprietary OS, there went your freedom. But I knew a way to change that. I was an operating system developer. I knew that I had a chance of finishing an operating system, especially if I asked lots of other people to help. And then we, the authors, could make it free, and thus we could give everyone a way to use a computer in freedom. By 1991, GNU was almost complete. One of the major components was missing. That was the kernel. The kernel is the component that allocates the machine's resources to the other programs you run. We started developing a kernel in 1990 called the GNU Herd. Unfortunately, I chose a powerful, elegant design, which turned it into a sort of research project, and it took 6 years to have a test version. Well, you can't win them all. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait that long, because in '91, Mr. Torvalds developed a kernel, which he called Linux, and he actually got it to work at a minimal level at the beginning, but that was enough. Unfortunately, in '91, Linux was not free software. It was released under a license that didn't give people freedoms 2 and 3 adequately. It didn't allow commercial redistribution. But in '92, he changed the license. He made Linux free software by releasing it under one of the various free software licenses of the day, namely the GNU General Public License. You've probably heard people say that they're using Linux or talk about Linux distributions. They're mistaken. They're not using Linux, the kernel, because a kernel by itself has no user interfaces. It wasn't designed to be used by itself. What they're using is the GNU system, plus Linux, the kernel. In other words, they're using the GNU/Linux combination. That's a complete operating system that you could actually use, and they're giving the credit for our work to someone else who started later and didn't do quite as much. And that's treating us badly. If you believe in giving people credit for their work, please call the system GNU/Linux or GNU+Linux. Please give us equal mention. We started this whole project, and not by accident. We are the ones who said, we're going to make freedom in the computing field through this operating system. And we have. And now our freedom exists, but it's precarious, constantly threatened in many different directions. We have a struggle on our hands still. Freedom is not guaranteed and safe. Of course, when you have a white supremacist, bully, liar as president of the US, I think it's pretty clear freedom is never secure and safe. So please help us do what we need to do. Just by making people aware that they're running the GNU system. And the way you do that is by calling it GNU, or GNU/Linux, to say which kernel is in there too. That helps us. It directs more attention towards us. So, in principle, GNU/Linux is a free operating system, but in practice, usually not. You see, there are thousands of different variants of GNU/Linux. They're called distros. And each one has a group of developers that decide what programs to put in it. And often they put in some non-free applications or some non-free device drivers or some non-free firmware blobs. And that makes their distro non-free. And the fact is, there are only a few, like 10 free distros. Look at gnu.org/distros to find more about this. And then there are thousands of non-free distros, which, well, they take you closer to freedom. They just don't get you all the way there. if you want to install a non-free distro like Ubuntu, well, yes, it's a lot better than Windows, but it will install some non-free software, and it will offer you a lot of other non-free programs. And then adding insult to injury, some of those are gratis, and it calls them free. So confusion is one of the problems caused by the non-free distros, but this isn't the only way. You see, because freedom is not what they're trying to offer people, they don't talk about it. People coming into the free software community get their ideas from what they see others talking about. If they see what Ubuntu talks about, well, it could say, you deserve freedom in your computing and you will not get it from us. But of course, they don't say that. Instead, they say, we aim to offer you the best possible user experience, which means they're calling people's attention to convenience and not to really important things like freedom. And it's effective. That teaches some people to value convenience, not freedom. Of course, people who don't value their freedom are going to lose it soon. So that puts freedom in danger. The free distros, they don't just respect your freedom, they also talk about why. And that's important to educate people. So, how do you make a program free? You do it by releasing the program under a license that gives users the 4 freedoms. In other words, under a free software license. So, every program under today's badly designed copyright law is automatically copyrighted because it's a written work, and every written work is automatically copyrighted. So, copyright law by default forbids copying, redistribution, modification of the program. In the US, it even forbids running the program in most cases, because that requires copying it into the computer's memory. Maybe you can argue that it's fair use. So how do we make a program free against the teeth of this nasty law? The only way you do it is with an explicit declaration by the copyright holders of the code, giving the users the 4 freedoms for that code. That is a free software license. That's why the free software license is crucial. That's what gives the users freedom. A program carrying no license is not free software. A culture has arisen, partly under the influence of GitHub, of being sloppy with licenses. There are people who foolishly think, oh, how annoying it is for people to insist. Well, of course, they can't really give orders, but we say, please pay attention to this. Be careful with your licensing. The reason is the license is what gives other people their rights. And if you're not careful with making it clear what the license is, they can't be sure, you can't be sure what rights you've been given. So it's vitally important to make it clear which license covers any given piece of code, which versions of the license are permitted by the authors. I did something when I made the first version of the GNU General Public License. I figured there would be new versions, and I figured that rather than just say to everybody, trust me about future versions, I gave the authors the choice. They could either say GPL version 1 or later, or they could say just GPL version 1. A lot of developers are sloppy about this, and they put a copy of GPL version 3 into the program, and they don't say on each source file, you can distribute this under GPL version 3 only, or you can distribute this under GPL version 3 or later. But it's important because there are programs that were released under GPL version 2 only, and now we have GPL version 3, and that's different. Those programs can't be, the GPL 2 only programs can't be combined with GPL 3 or later programs because they have no overlap. One's only GPL 2 and the other is 3 or later. There's no overlap there. This is why it's important nowadays to release under GPL 3 or later, because maybe someday we'll have to make a GPL version 4. I hope not, but you know, nobody can be confident of making no mistakes ever. So far, there's no need for a GPL version 4. But who knows? In 10 years, it may be necessary. When that happens, it's important for your software to be ready to adapt to it. When I first did this, I didn't think I could ask people to say, well, I couldn't insist that everybody should trust me with version 2 and 3, but people have accepted Creative Commons pretty well. Creative Commons says if you're using version N, automatically version N+1 and N+2, et cetera, will be allowed. If you release something under version 4 Creative Commons licenses, when they come out with version 5, the version 5 licenses will be usable also for those works. So also the Mozilla public license does this, and some others too. So it's getting to be accepted. And there is no organization in the world that has been steadier for its principles than the Free Software Foundation. If you can't trust us, who in the world could you trust? There are various kinds of free software licenses in use. There are real differences between free software licenses. They all give you the 4 freedoms, but there are various ways to do that, various details that are different between licenses. So the 2 main classes are the lax permissive or weak licenses and the copyleft licenses. The lax permissive licenses, such as the Apache license, they basically say yes to everything. They say, do whatever you like with this code. So, of course, that makes it free software. The problem is it says yes to too much. When a company comes along and says, we'd like to turn this into a proprietary program, that's permitted also. IBM, in fact, did so with Apache. IBM made a proprietary modified version of Apache. When you see the numbers of how many websites are running Apache, I think that includes the IBM version too. So you can't they're all using the code of Apache, but they don't all get the freedom. The ones using the IBM version don't get the same freedoms that Apache gives. I had seen other examples of this back in the 1980s. When I first had some GNU software to release, I knew that if I released it under some sort of lax license, that most of the users would get proprietary versions and the GNU project would fail in its aim of giving users freedom. So I invented a method of stopping that called copyleft. The basic idea of copyleft is that it puts a condition on how you redistribute. For freedoms 2 and 3, the freedoms to redistribute without or with changes. Copyleft says when you redistribute, you must pass along the same 4 freedoms to those that get copies from you. So just as we respected your freedom, you must then respect the freedom of others as you pass along anything that includes any significant amount of our code. And that's how copyleft defends freedom for all users. That's the purpose. It's not enough for us to avoid being the ones that take away others' freedom. We want to make sure they actually get the freedom, that nobody else manages to take it away from them either. And that's what the GNU General Public License and other GNU licenses do. The result is that companies often cooperate with the development of GNU software. If they want the available version to have certain features, well, the only lawful way they can do that is to release the code for those features as free software. There are various ways they can do that, and it turns out that usually the best one is to cooperate with the main developers of the free version and get it into there. That makes it fully available in the most convenient way. So they do. So once all the software installed on your machine is free, there's still other ways things can go wrong. For instance, there are websites that send non-free programs to your machine and try to run them in your browser. They're typically JavaScript programs. We don't want to be controlled by the JavaScript code from websites, so we developed Libra.js, whose purpose is, well, it's an add-on for Firefox, and it analyzes all the JavaScript programs to see if they're either free or trivial. And in those cases, they're allowed to run. But any non-trivial, non-free program is blocked. And you can see by clicking on a button whether there's blocked JavaScript code and what it is and so on. Whatever else you want to do, you can do. There's one other feature. It searches heuristically through the site looking for where and how to complain to the webmasters. And the complaint we want you to send is, I couldn't use your site because it tried to make me run non-free JavaScript code. Please fix it. The details will be inserted automatically, and this way it only takes you a minute to complain. In 10 minutes a day, you could complain to 10 different sites, and that would be useful help to the movement, so please do it. By the way, we're in the middle of completely rewriting Libra.js, and anyone here who's a JavaScript expert and wants to help with this project or another, please send me email. There's another way you can lose control of your computing nowadays. Used to be that happened because you installed and ran a non-free program, but now there's another way, which is service as a software substitute. What that means is the user entrusts per computing to somebody else's server. So the user has to send all the pertinent data to the server, which is effectively snooping on the user, and then the computing is done, but it's the server owner that controls, the service owner at least, that controls how the computing is done, what computing is done. The user doesn't control that. And then the server sends back the results. So this is equivalent in practical effect to running a non-free program. It's a program that the user can't study or control, only the service operator can study and control it. And because it collects the server can keep the data, right? So it's spying on the user, and it's equivalent to a universal backdoor also. When you run a proprietary program with a universal backdoor, it means the developer at any time can change the code that's running, that's doing your computing. Well, if you trust SAS, service as a software substitute, that's SAS, the server operator at any time can put in other software and thus change how your computing activity is done. It's the same result. So basically, never trust somebody else's server to do your computing activity. Now, if you're part of a group that are working together on something, it's okay if one of them brings the supercomputer. That's a different kind of situation socially from entrusting your project to some company which you have no basis to trust. And note that communication activities, they have to go through the network. You can't communicate with me inside your own computer. So that's a different kind of situation. Yeah, of course, when we're communicating with each other, we go through computers belonging to others, many of which could be called servers, and the rest might be called gateways. But that's the only way communication can be done, so that's the only way we can do it. So we want freedom, but there are obstacles to get over. One of them is social inertia. The companies that subject people to non-free software make lots of money. So they can do a lot of things to create obstacles against escaping from the non-free software. For instance, they can build up artificial network effects, which pressure, so that every user pressures other people to be users. This is why I absolutely refuse to use Skype even for a second, even in someone else's computer, because anyone who uses Skype is pressuring other people to use Skype. Now, if you use Skype, probably the reason is that other people pressured you. So you start out being a victim. But by doing so, you're pressuring them. So you're a victim co-perpetrator. The network effect, when it pushes people into accepting mistreatment, makes them victim co-perpetrators. And of course, mainly they're victims. It's not as, I don't condemn them. But the point is, you've got a duty not to be a co-perpetrator. I wouldn't say you have a duty not to be a victim, not as such. But you've got a duty not to be a co-perpetrator, and that means you shouldn't use Skype or any other communication system that requires you to run non-free software or is unjust in some other way, like Facebook. Facebook doesn't have users, it has useds. If you look around, you'll see more examples of social inertia being constructed by companies big enough to try to change the social environment we live in. Another obstacle is the term open source. That term was coined in 1998 as a way to talk about free software without mentioning freedom or raising any ethical issues in ethical terms. With their new term, which didn't refer directly to freedom at all, they had the chance to construct a different discourse which doesn't raise ethical issues. It doesn't present the subject as a matter of right and wrong, justice or injustice. It focuses on convenience and only convenience. We say, if you develop and release a program, it is your moral obligation to respect users' freedom to study, change, and redistribute that program. Open source supporters won't talk about a moral duty. They will recommend that you do the same thing, but only recommend. They'll say, if you develop and distribute a program, please consider whether it's in your practical interest to let the users change and redistribute that program, because then they might improve the code quality. So the difference is at the deepest level, the level of values. So we're trying to teach people to join us in valuing freedom and community, and open source doesn't try. Well, most of the people in the community were supporters of open source back then. Most of the companies, too. So the politicians and the journalists mostly followed the money, and since then, in the mainstream media, you see open source, and hardly ever free or libre. So what do? We now have to work hard to inform people about the ideas of free software. We can't assume that they'll find out about those from using our software, because most of the people they hear are calling our software open source and giving people to think we are supporters of open source, which we're not. And I work very hard to prevent anyone from being misleadingly led to think I advocate open source. I have never done that. Because advocating open source means failing to advocate what I really stand for. But every week I get mail from people asking me to comment on something from an open source viewpoint, and I have to explain, well, you've been misinformed. Other people who disagree with me advocate open source. My viewpoint is the free software movement. If you want to find out what the open source non-movement thinks, you'll need to talk with people who are in it. But worst, I've seen articles, the last one was a month or so ago, that called me the father of open source. Imagine what that makes me feel. What can I do? I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination, using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. And then I explain about the free software movement and what it stands for and what we've done, and that's the serious point of the letter, but it's always fun to start with a joke. Well, I can't do enough. There are other free software activists. We can't do enough. We need to do a lot more. We need your help. And the way you can help is just by insisting on saying free software or Libre software, always. Don't say open source. Well, of course, what you say is up to you. Maybe you agree with open source, and then you have the right to say so. I respect that right. But if you agree with me, why give a contrary impression? You don't have to ever say open source unless that's what you think. As for the term FOSS, well, that was intended to refer to both free software and open source, talking about it as a practical thing, not bringing up the ethics, which is where the two disagree. But unfortunately, that basically supports open source mostly. The idea you get from that, just the practices rather than the ethical part, that's the open source idea. And in addition, when it says free and open source software, open source is consecutive, free software is split apart, and people might think that the free means gratis. So it's not really a way of mentioning both on equal terms. It privileges open source over free software. There's another term, FLOSS, free Libre and open source software. In these two, the two have equal, in this, the two have equal weight. So it does present the two on a more or less equal basis. If that's what you want to do, FLOSS is the best term for doing that. But I don't use that term because I'm not trying to present the two equally. I stand for free software and freedom. I want everyone to see that as clearly as possible. If you share those ideas with me, do the same thing I do. Another obstacle is hardware whose specs are secret, where they will sell you the hardware and they refuse to tell you how to use it. Instead, they offer you some non-free driver or non-free firmware blob, and they say, use that and shut up. But that would take away our freedom, so we don't use it. What we need to do is reverse engineering. Somebody clever has to figure out how the software talks to that hardware, what the interface is between them, and passing that to someone else. Well, there are lots of people in our community who can write the free software to do that job once we know what the job consists of. If you want to make a technical contribution to the free software world and freedom, and you want it to be a really important one, this is what you should do. And I urge universities to teach classes in reverse engineering. In addition to being a vital area for progress towards freedom, it's also a lucrative professional career. The university should be teaching it for both reasons. Speaking of teaching, schools should teach exclusively free software. And when I say schools, that means all levels of schools. And when I say that's, in other words, from kindergarten to the university and adult education. They should all be teaching exclusively free software. And when I say teach, I don't just mean formal instruction where they say, push this key to insert an image into your slide. No. Anything that leads students to use certain software, that gets them accustomed to using that software, encourages them to practice using that software, that's teaching. It's all teaching. And the school should only teach free software. And this should not be a mysterious policy which they follow because somebody gave an order. Just the opposite. The school should teach the reasons, the civic values that underlie this policy. Because the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a society that is strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free. That applies to all fields, but in the software field, the way you do it is by graduating users that are accustomed to free software and freedom. To teach a proprietary program is the direct opposite of the school's social mission. It's implanting dependence, something that a school should never do. Teaching the use of a non-free program is like teaching the students to use addictive drugs. Don't. But there's also moral education and citizenship. We need to teach our children to help other people, the habit of helping other people. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including the source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, it's not permitted to bring proprietary software into this classroom unless it's for reverse engineering. It's the only legitimate thing to do with a proprietary program in a school. The school, to set a good example, has to follow its own rule. It has to bring only free software to class and share copies of the source code with everyone in the class, except for exercises in reverse engineering, because in that case the source code is the answer, so they give that out after the students have submitted their work. But there's also education in software development. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's a proprietary program, it denies that knowledge to the students. So it's the enemy of the spirit of education, and it should not be tolerated in a school except for reverse engineering, which is the way you extract the knowledge that the program denies to the students. But free software offers its knowledge to the students. It supports the spirit of education. Schools, to be true to the spirit of what they're supposed to do, must demonstrate this by insisting on free software and rejecting non-free. How do you learn to write good, clear code? You do it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Only free software gives you the chance to read the code of large programs we really use. Then you have to write lots of code. To learn to write good code for large programs, you have to write lots of code for large programs. But when you're starting out, you're not yet ready to write large programs from zero and do a good job. You don't know what a good job is. The way you learn that is by trying to change other large programs. So, how do you start small in writing code for large programs? By writing changes for existing large programs, and only free software gives you the chance to do that. So free software is the only way to give people who are learning programming the chance to learn to do it well and write good, clear code for their large programs. Every school can offer students the opportunity to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school. Human rights depend on each other. If we lose one human right, it becomes harder to defend the others. Now that we use computing for so many vital activities in our lives and in our communities and society, control of our computing, in other words, free software, has become one of the human rights that's vital to defend the rest. So we all have to help. And sometimes that requires making a sacrifice. Fortunately, in our field, they're not generally big sacrifices. They're sacrifices of convenience. But there are people who don't have the courage to do that. You say to them, how about switching from this proprietary program to this free program that respects your freedom? And they respond, when you can show me a free program that is 100% as convenient, fast, reliable, and so on for doing this job, then I'll switch. By insisting on 100%, what they're saying is that the amount of sacrifice they will make to protect their freedom is 0. Well, you can't make them change their minds. You can point to them as examples of fools. The fool and per freedom are soon parted. So how do you help our cause? Well, if you're a good programmer, write free software. Contribute to free software projects. I suggest you contribute to 15 projects run by others before you start running your own. That way you'll learn how to do a good job when you run your own. But most people are not good programmers. However, there are lots of important things they can do for the free software movement. People naively assume that contribution has to be software. That's not true. You can organize the campaign for free software. You can, for instance, you can become a free software speaker and spread these ideas. Or if you like to stay in the background, if you're shy, you can become the person who keeps the membership list and arranges meetings and invites speakers. Both vital activities. You can help persuade schools and governments to switch to free software. For schools, I've given you the explanation. Look at gnu.org/education for more info. But for governments, there are particular reasons why it's their obligation to use free software and only free software. It's because governments do their computing for the people. The government exists for the people. It has no other reason to do anything whatsoever. And when it's doing computing for the people, it has the responsibility to maintain control over that computing. This is the computational sovereignty of the country. The state agencies must never allow control of the computing that they do for the country and thus for the people to fall into any private hands. So if you lose control of your computing, you being an individual, that's a shame for you. So if I find this out, I wouldn't get angry at you. I would be sorry for you. I would say that you've made a mistake, and I would suggest that you change it. But ultimately, the one who loses if you lose control of your computing is you. You lose freedom. You're not the culprit, you're the victim. But public agencies have since they're doing their computing for all of us, they have a duty to maintain control of that computing. If they give it up, That's not just too bad for them. That's wrong of them. It's a failing of their responsibility before the people. They are obligated to correct that. And when the agency that loses control of the country's computing in this way has a critical function, if it's the Army or the police or the firemen or the telephones or the electric power or anything that's really necessary, then it's a threat to national security. 25 years ago, I know some people at DARPA, they were unhappy that they had paid for the development of some software and they then had to pay for permission to use it. But I was more concerned with the fact that they didn't have control over it as they were using it. So look at gnu.org/government for suggested policies for how to shift public agencies to free software. Of course, that's going to take a long time, and these proposed policies are based on that awareness. You can't turn something so big in a day or a year. It's going to take a long time. Even a university couldn't change in a month or even 1 year. But it's important to take steps that are big enough that they would get there in a decade, rather than steps so tiny they might get there in a few centuries. There's a tendency to do that, to say, well, we'll try a little pilot project for the next 5 years and see if we can change some tiny little thing. That's not really trying to ever get there. Another thing you can do is help other users. If you're an expert user of gnu/linux and other free software, you can start a gnu/linux user group or go to an existing one and help the users there. If you go to an existing one and you find it's called ostensibly a Linux user group, you can help the users there and explain why the group ought to change its name in order to give us equal mention for the community of freedom that we started. And just by saying free software or Libre software, you're helping the cause in an important way. Suppose you get into a discussion online and there are some people arguing about whether to use open source or not. And because of the term that's been used to formulate the discussion, they're arguing about practical questions only. You can say, this is not just about those practical questions. We should have control over our computing. So we must insist on free Libre software. Well, by persistently sticking to this, even if you don't win, in a narrow sense, you'll have educated people in the list. You'll have made people aware of the issues that they weren't thinking about before. And that's an advance in any case. So if you do this reasonably well, you've got to achieve something. There are probably 50 people just reading the list for each one who speaks up. And all those people can be educated by what you say. For more information, look at gnu.org. gnu.org/distros tells you about which distros are free and which are not. gnu.org/licenses explains all about free software licenses, which licenses are free, which licenses are copyleft, which have various flaws, so you shouldn't use them, which licenses don't defend your rights properly. And we also have recommendations for when you've written something, how to choose the license depending on the circumstances. That's in gnu.org/licenses/license recommendations.html. Together with advice about how to use the GNU licenses. We also have gnu.org/philosophy, which has dozens of essays addressing particular philosophical and political questions related to free software. There's also gnu.org/GNU, which gives the history of GNU, and there is gnu.org/help, and various other directories as well. So you can also look in fsf.org to find information about the Free Software Foundation. In resources, you'll find many kinds of resources to help you use, distribute, and develop free software. In campaigns, you'll find lots of different activities you can support or help in. There's also a store, although we have a store at that table right now where you can buy FSF gear. Are there the gratis stickers there as well? But it's good to put them in a different place, just so that the people taking stickers don't crowd you. If you want to move some stickers down to the nearly unoccupied table, a couple of them down, then that will be easy. It'll make it easier for people to take stickers on their way out and not get in the way of anybody who wants to buy something. You could also become a member of the Free Software Foundation. You can do it in fsf.org, or you can go up to them. They can accept your dues and make you a member. And of course, this is an adorable GNU that needs a home, and in a couple of minutes I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. But first it's time to present my other identity. Come on, stay. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as an extensible text editor that I had written, which developed into a way of life for many users. As they extended it so much, they could do all their computing without ever leaving Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs, which you might find amusing to visit. In the Church of Emacs today, we have a great schism between various versions of Emacs, and we also have saints, but no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor, Emacs. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must pronounce the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then, if you become a true expert, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Fu Bar Mitzvah, in which you chant a portion of our sacred scriptures. That is to say, the system source code. You see, we have eliminated the priesthood of technology. Everyone is welcome to read our sacred scriptures. There is also the cult of the Virgin of Emacs, which means anyone who has never known or used Emacs. And according to the Church of Emacs, offering the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. There is also the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. There is a breakaway Tibetan sect which claims that it's sufficient to invoke them automatically under the control of a script. But the Mother Church holds that to gain spiritual merit, you must type them by hand. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches that I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever demonic proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your regular use, and then install a wholly free operating system, and then use and install exclusively free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint and you'll have the right to wear a halo, if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. People occasionally, well, there is a traditional rivalry between Emacs and the other text editor VI. So people have occasionally asked me whether in the Church of Emacs the use of VI is a sin. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast, but using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. A few years ago, I went to China, and some VI users proposed to find me and attack me. I was shocked, but apparently violence begins with VI. People occasionally ask whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you. Now it's time for the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I can sign the card for you. If you have a penguin at home, you need to get a GNU for your penguin. Every penguin needs a GNU. So, when you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount you're bidding, because you need me to hear you. Don't wait for me to look at you before you shout. No, shout so I will look at you. If you're interested in bidding, I suggest you come closer. It's dark in this room. Very dark. Is there anything they can do to give us more light? We can accept payment in cash, with checks, with credit or debit cards, and also with Bitcoin if you have something here to make the payment with, so I can see that you've paid. And I'm going to start with the with the regular price of $25. Do I get $25 for this adorable canoe? How much? How much? 50. Do I get 60? I've got 50. Do I get 60? 60. I've got 60. What? Who's shouting? Who said 70? I've got 70. Do I get 80? I've got 70. Do I get 80? You can. Who said 80? I've got 80. Do I get 90? 100. Who said 100? I've got 100. Do I get 110? I've got 100. Do I get 110 for this adorable canoe? 110. Who said 110? You? I got 110. Do I get 120? I've got 120. Do I get 130? I've got 120. Do I get 130 for this adorable canoe? 150. Do I get 160? I've got 150. Do I get 160? 160 for this adorable canoe. 160 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. I've got 160. Do I get 170? I've got 160. Do I get 170? Who? Who said that? You? Okay, thank you. 200. I've got 200. Do I get 220? I've got 220. I've got 200. Do I get 220? 220 for this adorable canoe? 220. What? I've got 220. Do I get 240? I've got 220. Do I get 240 for this? Who said 240? Do I get 260? I've got 240. Do I get 260? By the way, the questions will start after the auction. I've got 240. Do I get 260? 260 for this adorable canoe. 260 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. I've got 260. Do I get 280? Do I get 280 for this adorable canoe? 280 to the Free Software Foundation. Last chance to bid 280 or more for this adorable canoe. Last chance to bid 280 or more to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance. Going. Who said? I've got 300. Do I get 335? I try to go up, sorry, 330. I try to go up by around 10%-ish, so as not to take too long to creep up there. Do I get 330 for this adorable canoe? 330 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance to bid 330 or more. Last chance. Going. Gone for 300. Please come up and pay. How do you wish to pay? So how do you wish to pay? Okay, you can work that out with the FSF person. Okay, Matt. Here's the picture. Come on over. You want to pay for the credit cards? Yep. But first, it's not time for photos, it's time for questions. Now it's time for your questions. I suggest you come closer, and I have hearing trouble. I will not be able to hear your words unless you speak like this, loud, slowly, and carefully. Okay?
You may know there are a few people here who work with gnu+linux administrative services, and you criticize the sacrifice of privacy associated with some of that, and I wonder if there are ever circumstances where we would give up that privacy.
Well, lots of people would, and lots of people do.
Okay, for reasons other than convenience, and one of the things that I would point out is, say, for the purpose of protesting in overreaching government, we have to step out, be seen, and identify.
Well, yes and no. We need to protest on the street, for instance. That doesn't mean it should be easy for the government to identify all the protesters. The U.S. government is trying to subpoena the IP addresses of all visitors to a site that was set up to protest the inauguration of the troll. And the ACLU is helping to fight that. I hope the government doesn't succeed in identifying all those visitors. Yes, if you're on the street, you can be seen. But we should make sure that the government can't set up cameras to recognize everybody on the street. We need laws to restrict massive surveillance systems, whether they are privately run or state-run, whether they're done by businesses or whatever. The only effective place to protect privacy is when somebody's going to try to collect the data. Once a database is collected, it will be misused. There are 4 ways it can be misused. It can be misused by the organization that collected it, which is probably planning to misuse it sooner or later. But even if that doesn't happen, it can be misused by rogue employees of that organization. It can also be stolen by crackers, people that break computer security. Please don't use the term hacker to mean someone that breaks computer security. That's insulting to us hackers. But anyway, those crackers exist, and they get lots of databases, and they misuse the data. In the U.S., it can also be misused by the state, which can use the USAP at Riot Act, because I refuse to use the word patriot to refer to that vicious law, which allows the FBI to take any of these databases without even going to court and then make the organization whose work was used to subject everyone to state surveillance keep silent about the fact it occurred. So if we want to be safe in our privacy, we have to restrict the systems that collect data about people. Now, I have an article called gnu.org/philosophy/ oh damn, I'm slipping my memory on the URL. It's called How Much Surveillance Can Democracy Withstand? Basically, we suffer from more surveillance than the people in the former Soviet Union did. We've got to make it less, we have to require systems to be designed so that they don't collect any more personal data than is necessary. Now, one solution, part of the solution is anonymous purchases on the internet. I don't ever buy anything on the internet because it's not anonymous, and I don't believe any company should be able to know what I'm buying. But we have something called gnu+linux, which allows for encrypted anonymous payments. Now, it's anonymous for the payer. It's not anonymous for the payee. Every store's income will be tracked by the system, but where the income came from will not be. So it'll be just like going into a store with some money and paying cash, which is the way I always buy things. Look at Thaler.net for more information. A system that implements purchases through Thaler is tolerable. Systems that don't support Thaler are intolerable. We've got to put an end to that practice. But there are many different kinds of systems that surveil and many techniques for redesigning them so that they don't surveil or don't surveil much. For instance, the systems that let people rent bicycles on the street, they're keeping track of everybody. They have to keep track of something. You know, if a person doesn't return the bicycle, they have to know who it was. But they don't have to know who rented a bicycle where when somebody does return the bicycle. They just have to collect the fee. So the system can be designed so that unless they change it, it won't record who paid a fee for where, unless the person failed to return the bike and it's late and they need to go after that person.
It seems like you're worrying about issues with software that are installed, but you're still not immune unless you also create your own silicon foundry.
That's true, but note, security and freedom are different. If you consider a car from 1970, there was nothing in that car that the owner couldn't work on. It respected the owner's freedom in this sense that we've been talking about. That doesn't mean it offered any particular security. There was probably no armor around the brake cables to stop anyone from cutting them, or many other things in the car that someone could have sabotaged. So security and freedom are different. Something we need to remember now. People who want us to give up our freedom so that they can supposedly keep us secure are threatening us terribly. But freedom is necessary to build security. If you don't control the software, you can't try to make it secure. Now, you're right. What's in the hardware affects our security as well. However, we don't have a simple solution. In the case of software, since it's made by compiling some source code, we can fix that problem more or less by making the software free. Someday, if we make our own chips, we'll be able to do the same thing with free hardware chip designs. But at present, we can't do that. As long as we're using chips made in factories through mass production, we just have no way to control them. But on the other hand, if they're made from free designs, it makes it somewhat easier to verify that they correspond to the design they supposedly do. So the free designs would help us somewhat in maintaining security, in verifying security at the chip level. The reason I don't reject chips made from non-free designs is that they've got to be made in factories anyway, so we still wouldn't really effectively have control over the designs that are used. Look at gnu.org/philosophy/freehardwaredesigns.html. No, it's not. It's not. I don't agree with formulating it solely in the government can't, because threats to freedom of speech, for instance, come from companies as well. Many kinds of freedoms are threatened by companies or the state. The state, basically, since there has been inequality in society, stronger or richer people have had a tendency to oppress the others. At one point, there was a great invention, democracy, which was set up so that the non-rich, those who were not specially powerful, could use the state to work together to be stronger than any of the rich so that they could stop the rich from mistreating them. We need a strong state to do this. We also need a state to do lots of other important things, like provide food for whoever's hungry, build roads, operate schools, set up a universal medical system, which our country perversely fails to have, and fund scientific research of benefit to everyone, and scientific research that simply answers the deep curiosities about the world, and so many other things. We need the state to make sure these rich people pay enough taxes, which in the U.S. they don't. So no, this is not, it's a mistake to say that this threat comes from the state. The worst threat comes from the rich.
I accept all of that. That wasn't my question. My question is, do you see the freedom of free software as being just a fundamentally different freedom than those other freedoms?
I see them as all being different. So no, and also each of those freedoms for me means not just in some theoretical sense, but in practice you really can do these things.
I hate to interrupt, but we have room for 5 more minutes of questions, and then the
Well.
staff has to clean up.
Oh well.
5 more minutes.
What do you think about the actual presidency in the United States?
Well, he's on the side of the rich, which we knew months ago, and he's on the side of the bigots and the Nazis, is now clear. So pretty horrible. But of course, you've got to realize that Republicans have been building up the bigotry and for years, as well as attacking democracy, trying to stop minorities and poor people from voting.
Clarify what you think about copyright. I understand. For example, if there was a law passed that abolished copyright,
Okay, I don't advocate abolishing copyright. I advocate reducing copyright power. If you want to see the details, look at gnu.org/philosophy/copyright-vs-community.html. So I believe people should be free to share, which means non-commercially redistribute exact copies only. People should be free to share copies of any published work. I also believe all the software you use should be free. Even if it isn't published, you should still have the 4 freedoms. And in regard to sharing copies, it's vital to block all the stratagems that they would use to practically deny you the freedom to share copies, even if nominally it's lawful. For instance, DRM. DRM is an injustice because it stops people from sharing copies, and they should be free to share. Likewise, end-user license agreements that forbid normal social cooperation, such as giving copies of works or lending them or sharing copies, those should be void. There should be a law saying such contracts have no value. Yes and no. In many practical ways, of course, they have lots of features that the herd has never got, because basically work on Linux took off starting in 1992 and more ever since, whereas the GNU herd is not in real practical use, so it doesn't have a community of people adding lots of prosaic but useful features to it. Its basic design is more elegant, but the point is, we needed a kernel. I wanted to do a nicer kernel, not something comparable to the kernel of Unix.
Last question.
is it possible today to make sure that two computers communicate together over the internet, transiting only through free software?
Well, I don't think we need to. I don't know, because you see, when these computers talk through internet gateways and so on, they don't know what software is running in those machines, and they have no reason to care. So I don't care what software is in in the Wi-Fi hub I'm talking to. It's not it doesn't affect me. If it's non-free software, that's bad for the owner of the Wi-Fi hub. But it's not something I need to ask about. I just changed my MAC address. I go through Tor. I make sure that they can't tell anything about me. Now I know they're not hurting me. That's enough for me. As for having any non-free software in their piece of hardware, that's something that they have a reason to care about, and I will support them in caring about it, but it's not a reason for me to boycott them.
Thank you very much.